welcome to the deep dive. Before we even get into the weeds today, do us a huge favor and hit those like and subscribe buttons right at the top of your screen.
Yeah, it genuinely helps us keep bringing you these deep dives.
And trust me, you are not going to want to miss a single second of what we have on the docket.
No, you're really not. Today is, well, we're doing something a little different.
Right. We are reviewing an ebook, diving into a highly requested, profoundly controversial, and honestly, utterly fascinating tech.
It was written specifically for a men's rights activist audience.
And the red-pilled manosphere men, yeah. The mission of this deep dive today is to thoroughly explore the author's arguments regarding the hidden history of our modern institutions.
Specifically, we're going to examine his bold claims about how these systems were captured by feminists and Marxists long before most of us were even born.
And what that structural capture actually means for the reality men navigate today.
So we are looking at a text by Conrad Riker, and it is a comprehensive, unapologetic deconstruction of society.
To put it mildly.
Right. The central premise here is about understanding the foundational history of our modern world, the invisible systems we live under, and the deeply ingrained evolutionary psychology that drives human behavior.
Underneath what he calls a thin veneer of civilization.
Exactly. It is a long, highly detailed look at how ancient biological imperatives are currently clashing with modern social engineering.
And let me tell you, this deep dive is going to be ultra long, incredibly incisive, and just packed to the brim with evolutionary data, historical analysis, and staggering family court statistics. We're covering a massive amount of ground today.
A ton of ground.
But if you want to read the raw material for yourself, and you absolutely should, if you want to understand the full, unfiltered architecture of these arguments, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book.
And also make sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker at Substack.
Yes, definitely do that. Now, before we unpack a single data point, I need to make a crucial impartiality disclaimer directly to you, the listener.
This is really important.
It is. The material we are covering today contains highly politically charged content. I want to clearly, unequivocally declare that neither of us here is taking any sides.
None at all.
We are not endorsing the viewpoints of this content. Our goal, our absolute mission for the next hour or so is simply to impartially report, unpack, and convey the ideas, the arguments, and the specific data contained in the original source material.
We are operating purely as analytical guides through a very complex landscape. The author presents a highly specific, very controversial worldview, and he backs it up with a specific set of data, evolutionary theories, and historical interpretations.
So our job is to map out the architecture of his claims so you can understand exactly what is being argued, how the conclusions are drawn, and the evidence he presents to get there.
Exactly. Let's jump right into section 1, which Riker calls the evolutionary blueprint and branch-swinging mechanics.
Okay, let's unpack this. We all know the basics of evolutionary psychology, the idea that our brains are essentially running prehistoric legacy software.
Right, the 200,000 years of wiring.
Yeah. But the author doesn't just mention this in passing. He builds his entire thesis on the idea that modern societal rules, progressive corporate policies, or HR departments fundamentally cannot override that wiring.
They can't even touch it, according to him.
So walk me through how he sets up this baseline. Specifically, I know he relies heavily on Dr. David Buss's work.
Yeah, he anchors his entire framework on Dr. David Buss's landmark 37 culture study.
For context, Buss is one of the foundational figures in evolutionary psychology.
He is.
Yeah.
And Riker takes this study and applies it directly to the modern social and corporate landscape. What Buss did was survey mating preferences across 37 distinct cultures globally.
We're talking about highly industrialized Western nations, agrarian societies.
Even isolated hunter-gatherer tribes. The goal was to see if there was a universal constant in what men and women look for in a mate, or if these preferences were just socially constructed by local cultures.
Right, nature versus nurture.
Exactly. And Riker emphasizes Buss's finding that across every single one of those 37 cultures, regardless of how progressive, egalitarian, or traditional, the society claimed to be women consistently, without fail, filtered for male provisioning capabilities, resources, and social status.
So the author is using this to argue that the desire for a high-status provider isn't a byproduct of the patriarchy or Disney movies.
No, he says it's a hard-coded survival mechanism. In our ancestral environment, a mate without resources or the physical capacity to protect didn't just mean a lower standard of living.
It meant starvation.
It meant starvation and death for the woman and her offspring. Riker's argument is that this biological imperative is so deeply etched into human DNA that it operates completely independent of modern feminist ideology or equal opportunity employment.
So a woman earning six figures in a modern corporate environment.
She still possesses the exact same neurological hardware as her hunter-gatherer ancestor. She still biologically craves a mate who out-earns and outperforms her, even if she doesn't consciously realize it.
And to prove that biology is always running in the background, overriding conscious thought, the book brings up some wildly specific, almost uncomfortable data points.
The lap dancer study.
Yes. There is a 2015 study published in Evolution in Human Behavior that completely threw me. Researchers actually tracked the shift earnings and tip amounts of lap dancers across their menstrual cycles.
It's a perfect distillation of Riker's premise.
Break down the methodology and the numbers here because the disparity is mind-blowing.
Okay, so researchers asked the dancers to log their shifts, their tip totals, and the exact phase of their menstrual cycle over a period of months. The results show a massive, statistically significant fluctuation in earnings based purely on fertility.
What were the actual numbers?
When the women were ovulating, meaning they were at peak fertility and biologically ready to conceive, they averaged $335 per shift.
Okay, it's 335.
But during the luteal phase, or menstruation, their earnings plummeted to an average of $185 per shift. And women taking hormonal birth control, which chemically simulates pregnancy and suppresses ovulation, saw no fertility-based peak in their earnings at all. They earned a flat, lower average across the board.
That is a staggering difference. We are talking about almost double the income simply because of a biological window. How does Riker synthesize this into his broader argument about the sexual marketplace?
He uses it as undeniable proof that biological reality does not care about social constructs or ideology. In that club environment, the men don't consciously know these women are ovulating.
Right, it's not like they have a sign-up.
Exactly. And the women likely aren't consciously changing their routines, but the men are evolutionarily hardwired to detect subtle, almost imperceptible fertility cues. Changes in skin tone, vocal pitch, scent, micro movements.
And the women's bodies broadcast those cues involuntarily.
Yes. This biological communication directly dictates the financial exchange. Riker argues that if raw subconscious biology can cause a man to hand over twice as much cash in the span of 3 days, we have to assume that same biology is driving the macro decisions in dating, marriage, and society at large.
Which brings us to the macro concept Riker spends a lot of time on. Hypergamy.
Right.
For you listening, if you are familiar with the manosphere, you've heard this term. But Riker defines hypergamy as the innate, unyielding evolutionary drive for women to trade up, to constantly seek the highest possible status and resource-holding male available to them.
And he points to modern dating apps as the ultimate, unfiltered, almost brutal laboratory testing this behavior.
What exactly do the Cupid and Tinder data sets reveal about how the two sexes filter each other? Because it's pretty bleak.
Very bleak. The dating app data Riker presents fundamentally maps out a new, highly skewed sexual economy. When you look at the digital sorting mechanisms of apps like Tinder and Cupid, it reveals a mathematical divergence in mating strategies.
How so?
The data shows that men distribute their likes, or right swipes, across a very broad swath of the female population. Men are swiping right on roughly 50% of female profiles.
So they're looking at the median distribution of women and deeming them acceptable mates.
Yes, their biological imperative is broad genetic distribution.
It's a standard bell curve for the men, but for the women, that bell curve completely collapses. The statistic in the text that is just brutal is how women rate male attractiveness.
The female swiping behavior forms an extreme Pareto distribution. The Cupid data cited in the book indicates that women rate an astounding 80% of men as below average in attractiveness.
Mathematically, that makes no sense. It is impossible for 80% of a population to be below the median.
Exactly. But Riker points out that this isn't about objective geometry or math. It is about evolutionary perception. Women are hyper-calibrated by hypergamy to only perceive the top tier of men as viable mates. The bottom 80% of men are essentially rendered invisible.
So what does this mean for the average guy? The guy in the 50th percentile who is swiping right on half the women he sees.
It means he is participating in a market where he has virtually zero purchasing power. Because of this perception distortion, the top 10 to 20% of men on these apps are receiving 90% of all female attention, messages, and matches.
Wow.
And Riker is adamant in framing this not as toxic app culture or the result of superficial social media standards. He views this as the purest expression of female biological mating strategies unleashed by technology.
Because without the historical constraints of arranged marriages, monogamy enforcement, or small tribal communities, technology has allowed hypergamy to scale globally.
Yes, women can now filter out 80% of local men because they have digital access to the top 20% of men across a 50-mile radius.
So we see this hyperselectivity playing out in the initial stages of dating on Tinder. But Riker argues that this evolutionary programming doesn't just switch off once you delete the app and say, I do.
Not at all.
In fact, that brings us to what he calls the mechanics of branch swinging. The concept here is that women are biologically programmed to continually scan their environment for a better, more secure provider, even when they are deeply partnered. Walk me through the psychological timeline he lays out here.
The text introduces what Riker terms the 6-week transition window. He cites research from the University of Texas that examines the dissolution of relationships.
What did the research find?
The data suggests that a massive 68% of women emotionally detach from a relationship weeks, or in many cases months, before they physically leave or initiate a breakup.
And Riker argues this is the modern manifestation of branch swinging.
He does. And the author is careful here to frame this not as intentional, calculated malice or sociopathy, but as an ancestral survival protocol.
Right, because in a prehistoric setting, a woman leaving a provider without another one lined up was basically a death sentence.
Precisely the evolutionary logic he applies. In prehistoric times, a woman couldn't afford to let go of one branch until she had a firm, tested grip on another. If she left her mate without a replacement, she and her offspring wouldn't survive the winter.
So the biological software mandates that she must secure a soft landing before terminating the current arrangement.
Exactly. Riker argues that modern women have just upgraded from literal tree branches and tribal hunters to stock portfolios, corner offices, and gym trainers.
To make this visceral, the text provides a really pertinent, chilling anecdote about a guy named Dave. Paint the picture of Dave's situation, because I think a lot of guys listening might find this scenario eerily familiar.
The anecdote of Dave serves as a warning beacon in the text. Dave is a mid-level engineer, a standard provider. For months, his wife had been constantly complaining about him being emotionally distant.
Saying he wasn't present, the spark was gone.
Right. Meanwhile, Dave is stressed because he is trying to navigate a complex mortgage refinance to secure their long-term financial future. He is working overtime, trying to be the bedrock provider society expects him to be.
And while he's doing this, she's executing the branch swing.
Unbeknownst to Dave, during this period of complaining about emotional distance, she is secretly sleeping with her CrossFit instructor. She is testing the new branch.
But she doesn't leave him yet.
No, she waits. She maintains the illusion of the marriage while Dave finalizes the grueling paperwork for the house. The very moment the house is refinanced, locking in the lower rate and securing the asset's value, the biological protocol completes.
And what happens?
She hands him divorce papers by certified mail that same afternoon and moves into the trainer's apartment days later.
It's a brutal narrative. Riker uses Dave's story to warn men that sudden nebulous complaints about emotional distance or needing space are rarely about actual emotional availability.
According to his framework, they are often a smokescreen, a biological protocol executing itself to justify the emotional detachment, while the woman secures a soft landing with a new partner, or secures the financial assets to survive solo.
It reframes relationship conflicts from psychological issues to purely evolutionary strategy.
If a man views his relationship through this evolutionary lens, he stops trying to communicate better to solve the emotional distance and instead recognizes the behavioral cues of an impending branch swing.
Which is a heavy, deeply cynical way to view a partnership. And from there, the book shifts its focus from the personal domestic sphere to the systemic. Section 2 dives into what the author calls the institutional minefield, directly taking on the most foundational feminist arguments about equality in the workplace.
He really goes after the established narratives here.
I want to start with how aggressively Riker deconstructs the famous 77-cent wage gap. He basically claims it's a massive statistical illusion. Walk me through the Department of Labor data he's using to back that up. How does he account for the discrepancy?
Well, Riker mounts a vigorous, data-heavy counter-argument against the prevailing narrative that men systemically and intentionally oppress women economically. The 77 cents on the dollar statistic is often cited as proof of a patriarchal system paying women less for the exact same work.
Right, that's the standard talking point.
But Riker uses Department of Labor and Pew Research data to completely dismantle that assertion. He points out that the 77-cent figure is simply an unadjusted average of all full-time working men versus all full-time working women, completely ignoring crucial variables.
What are the variables the data says are being ignored?
The two biggest variables are hours worked and career choices. When you look at the raw hours, men are working, on average, 9% more hours annually than women.
Men are far more likely to work overtime, take on weekend shifts, and accept jobs that require extensive, unpredictable travel.
Secondly, there's a massive difference in occupational selection. Riker argues that men, driven by testosterone and the evolutionary need to act as providers, biologically gravitate toward high-risk, high-reward, physically demanding, and dangerous jobs.
While women gravitate towards safer, more flexible, often heavily socially oriented roles that prioritize work-life balance over raw financial output.
Exactly. And when you control for those factors, same job title, same hours worked, same continuous years of experience without career breaks, Riker claims the gap doesn't just shrink, it practically vanishes.
In fact, he brings up a demographic where the gap is reversed entirely.
This is one of his key data points. The text highlights that childless women under the age of 30 actually out-earn their male counterparts in numerous major U.S. cities, including New York and Los Angeles.
So when women act like traditional men in the workplace,
Foregoing children, working massive hours, and fiercely negotiating.
the free market rewards them equally, if not more so.
Therefore, he concludes, the wage gap is not a penalty for being female. It is a penalty for working fewer hours in safer, lower-paying industries.
Which brings us to a really dark but absolutely crucial part of the book's argument, the death gap. If the wage gap is a myth built on career choices, the death gap is the brutal reality of what those choices entail for men.
The death gap is a central pillar of Riker's argument regarding male disposability. Society places intense focus on equal representation in safe, air-conditioned corporate boardrooms, but completely ignores the environments where men are dying.
He pulls statistics from the Bureau of Labor Statistics for this, right?
Yes. The book highlights stark statistics showing that men make up 93% of all occupational fatalities.
93%. We are talking about the invisible infrastructure of society. Oil rig workers, loggers, commercial deep-sea fishers, roofers, high-voltage linemen, and construction workers.
Exactly. Riker asserts a provocative historical and biological reality. Civilization is, and always has been, built on male bones. The infrastructure that allows modern society to function, the power grid, the sanitized water systems, the asphalt, the skyscrapers, is maintained exclusively by men willing to trade their physical safety, and often their lives, for a paycheck to provide for their families.
He uses this tragic anecdote of a 2019 Texas oil rig explosion to illustrate this, paint the picture of that incident because it perfectly captures his point about societal hypocrisy.
The text details this horrific blowout on a rig in Texas where 7 bodies were eventually pulled from the scorched wreckage. All 7 were men. All 7 were fathers. All 7 were husbands.
Just out there doing deeply dangerous work to extract the energy that keeps hospitals running and homes heated.
Riker's argument here is that modern society completely pathologizes male testosterone and traditional masculinity, labeling it toxic in academia and media. Yet, simultaneously, society relies entirely, 100%, on that exact same toxic testosterone to do the terrifying, backbreaking labor that keeps civilization from collapsing.
He even extends this from the workplace to literal warfare, pointing to the current conflict in Ukraine. He cites a 97% male combat death rate there.
It's a really sharp point he makes.
His point is that in peacetime, men are told their masculinity is a problem, but the minute the borders are breached and bombs start falling, society's expectation of absolute, uncompromising male sacrifice is reinstated instantly. Men are legally barred from leaving the country and forced into the meat grinder.
It is the ultimate expression of male disposability. Riker argues that society demands male utility and ultimate sacrifice, while aggressively demonizing the biological traits, aggression, stoicism, physical strength, risk tolerance that enable that sacrifice.
And this leads to his broader sociological theory. What happens when men realize this game is rigged? He calls this the Atlas spiral.
Like Atlas shrugging, dropping the world.
Walk me through the mechanics of the Atlas spiral.
The concept is simple but profound. The Atlas spiral is the systemic collapse that occurs when male leadership, innovation, and protective instincts are sidelined, punished, or simply opt out.
Because if society tells men they are inherently toxic, legally vulnerable, and culturally obsolete, eventually men will stop building, stop protecting, and stop sacrificing.
Exactly. And Riker points to a fascinating micro example in China, the Masuo matriarchal tribe.
Right. This is a society that actually tried to eliminate male leadership. What were the concrete results Riker cites?
According to the author's analysis of the Masuo, when this society fully shifted to female-led households and stripped men of their traditional roles as heads of families and primary providers, the men essentially checked out.
They became decorative.
They engaged in leisure activities but had no societal building role. The result, Roker claims, was a 40% plummet in overall societal productivity and innovation. The tribe stagnated.
So the author uses this as a microcosm, proving that when men shrug, when they are no longer incentivized by status and family authority to do the heavy lifting, the world falls into disrepair.
He also targets a macro example: Sweden.
Sweden is constantly held up by progressive sociologists as the ultimate shining utopia of gender equality. But Riker looks at their data and draws the exact opposite conclusion.
The critique of Sweden is a fascinating counterintuitive argument. Sweden has implemented decades of aggressive, state-funded, gender-neutral policies. They engineered their education system and workplace incentives to perfectly equalize the sexes.
But Riker claims that the result of this massive social engineering was the Nordic paradox.
Right. Sweden actually ended up with the highest gender-based job segregation in all of Europe.
Meaning that when you give men and women ultimate freedom and remove all financial pressure, they double down on their biological inclinations.
Precisely. Given total freedom and state safety nets, Swedish women still overwhelmingly chose to go into nursing, childcare, and social work. Swedish men still overwhelmingly chose engineering, heavy industry, and tech.
For Riker, this is definitive, undeniable proof that biology absolutely overrides social engineering. You cannot legislate away inherent evolutionary preferences.
If the most progressive country on Earth couldn't engineer a perfectly balanced 50-50 outcome in occupational choices, it's because the premise that men and women are biologically identical blank slates is fundamentally flawed.
That is a huge paradigm shift. And if the workplace is this ideological minefield, the book paints the legal system as an active, hostile war zone designed to strip mine men of their resources. Let's move into Section 3, the family court cartel and the erasure of fatherhood.
This is where his rhetoric gets really intense.
Riker takes an absolute sledgehammer to the concept of no-fault divorce. For you listening, no-fault divorce means you can dissolve a marriage without having to prove infidelity, abuse, or abandonment. You can just leave. How does Riker view this legal framework?
Riker views no-fault divorce as the mechanism that weaponized marriage against men. The statistics he presents here are designed to shock the reader out of complacency. The text claims that women currently initiate 70 to 80% of all divorces.
And among college-educated women, that number can climb even higher.
Riker argues that the family court system does not act as an impartial arbiter of justice. Instead, he characterizes it as a divorce industrial complex, a massive cartel that actively incentivizes women to leave marriages by rewarding them with a profound financial windfall.
So tying this back to the first section, he's saying the legal system has monetized branch swinging.
Exactly. It removes the risk from hypergamy. Historically, if a woman left a providing husband without cause, she faced financial ruin. Today, Riker argues, the state steps in as a surrogate husband, forcefully extracting resources from the biological father to fund the mother's new lifestyle.
This, he claims, monetizes male disposability. The anecdotes he uses to illustrate this financial extraction are brutal. Imagine spending your entire life building a career and you end up like the San Jose engineer in the book.
That case study is horrifying.
This guy worked 80-hour weeks in tech, built a massive nest egg, bought the beautiful house. His wife initiates a no-fault divorce because she isn't happy. What is his reality now?
Despite doing everything right according to the traditional male script, providing, working hard, staying loyal, he ends up legally evicted from his own home. He is currently living in a converted garage apartment, eating ramen, while he's legally mandated to pay his ex-wife $12,000 a month in alimony.
$12,000 a month.
In the text notes, she uses this money to fund international vacations to Bali and maintain her upper middle class lifestyle without having to work.
And there's the California mechanic, a blue-collar guy who has to work 3 separate jobs, destroying his physical health, just to fund his ex-wife's beachfront condo.
Riker argues that because of these legal precedents, marriage licenses have essentially become financial suicide notes for men. You are signing a contract where the other party is financially incentivized to break it.
But the financial ruin is only half of the equation for Riker. The other half, the arguably more destructive half for society, is the systemic erasure of fatherhood through custody battle.
Right. The book details statistics showing that mothers win 80 to 90% of primary custody battles, even in cases where fathers are highly capable, have no criminal records, and are actively fighting in court for equal 50-50 time with their children.
The courts just default to the mother. Riker introduces a psychological concept here that he calls maternal gatekeeping syndrome. For you listening, Riker isn't just talking about a mother being naturally protective of her infant. He is citing this as a deeply embedded, sometimes pathological, biological protocol. Walk me through maternal gatekeeping.
Maternal gatekeeping syndrome, as defined by Riker, is the biological wiring that causes mothers to monopolize control over their offspring. In the ancestral environment, tight control over children ensured their immediate physical safety from predators.
Sure, makes sense historically.
But in the modern legal environment, Riker argues this instinct becomes pathological. Mothers often view the father not as an equal partner in parenting, but as an incompetent assistant or even a threat to her absolute authority. And she uses the family court system to legally enforce this monopoly, executing what is known as parental alienation.
The parental alienation examples in the text are wild, almost surreal. There's an anecdote about a father whose ex-mother-in-law literally called Child Protective Services on him.
Oh.
And the reason wasn't abuse or neglect. What was the trigger?
The trigger was a cookie.
A cookie?
Yes. The father had weekend custody, and his new wife, who the ex-wife and her mother despised out of jealousy, baked a batch of non-GMO organic cookies for the toddler. The toddler ate one, went home to the mother, and mentioned the cookie.
And the mother-in-law weaponized this.
She called CPS and claimed the father was negligently exposing the child to unknown dietary risks, launching a massive, stressful, and costly state investigation into his home.
It sounds utterly absurd, like a dark comedy. But Riker uses it to make a terrifying point. The system is so heavily biased toward the mother's narrative that it allows maternal networks to weaponize the full force of the state against fathers over absolutely nothing. The father has to spend thousands in legal fees just to prove he isn't a danger for feeding his kid a cookie.
And this raises the ultimate macro-societal question. What is the cost of this family court cartel? What happens when a society systematically removes fathers from the home and replaces them with state-mandated alimony checks?
Riker pulls data from the CDC and the Department of Justice to show the catastrophic fallout of fatherlessness. The statistics are horrifying.
They really are.
According to the data cited, 85% of all incarcerated youth kids in juvenile detention come from fatherless homes. 71% of high school dropouts come from fatherless homes.
Riker points out that society often tries to explain this away as a symptom of poverty. But he argues that the biological father isn't just a secondary caregiver or an ATM. His physical presence provides vital testosterone regulation and strict behavioral boundaries for boys.
Mothers provide unconditional love and nurturing, which is essential, but fathers historically provide conditional love, meaning love tied to performance, discipline, and societal integration.
Right. Removing that male authority, the book claims, leaves young boys emotionally dysregulated. They have no model for how to channel their own developing testosterone, leading directly to the societal chaos, skyrocketing gang violence, and crime rates we see in fatherless demographics.
Okay, we need to move into section 4, because this is where the book dives into its most intensely controversial psychological claims. This is where Riker discusses the BPD spectrum reality.
This is a heavy chapter.
BPD stands for borderline personality disorder. Usually psychologists view this as a severe, relatively rare clinical diagnosis. But Riker makes this sweeping, incendiary claim that these traits don't just exist in a small clinical subset, but actually exist on a subclinical spectrum in almost all women. What is the biological driver he blames for this?
He attributes this spectrum of volatility entirely to severe hormonal fluctuations, specifically the monthly tidal waves of estrogen and progesterone.
It is a highly provocative claim.
Very much so. Riker argues that what polite society dismisses as normal mood swings, PMS, or women being emotional, is actually a deeply ingrained evolutionary threat detection system constantly misfiring and going into overdrive. Because women historically lacked physical strength, their defense mechanism was psychological hypervigilance, constantly scanning their environment and their mate for minute signs of danger or abandonment.
And when that hypervigilance combines with hormonal spikes, it results in extreme behavioral volatility. He uses an anecdote of a friend whose wife threw his Xbox out a second-story window during a PMS week because he didn't hear a question she asked.
Exactly. Modern society tells men to laugh that off. Happy wife, happy life. She's just stressed. Riker frames this not as a quirky sitcom-style relationship conflict, but as a dangerous systemic emotional volatility that men are forced to constantly navigate, absorb, and defend against without any legal or social recourse.
If a man threw a woman's laptop out a window, he would be arrested for domestic violence. When a woman does it, it's a punchline.
And the defense mechanism that modern society and therapy culture tells men to use when facing this volatility is communication. Open up, be vulnerable, share your feelings.
But Riker calls this the vulnerability trap.
What's fascinating here is how the vulnerability trap is one of the most compelling sociological observations in the book. Society constantly hammers men with the message that traditional stoicism is toxic. Men are told they need to cry, they need to be vulnerable, they need to deconstruct their masculine armor.
But Riker cites extensive surveys from Match.com and Psychology Today that reveal a massive silent hypocrisy. Let's talk about those surveys because they pull the mask off the whole thing.
In these anonymous surveys, vast majorities of women admitted to feeling an immediate and visceral loss of sexual attraction to men who cry or display emotional weakness, especially early in a relationship.
The women reported feeling the ick or feeling unsafe.
Riker argues that biologically, a woman's ancient hardware is seeking a stoic protector. When a man cries or crumbles under stress, he signals to her primitive brain that he cannot handle his own emotional load, let alone protect her and her offspring from a prehistoric threat or a modern crisis.
The real-world examples the book uses perfectly highlight this fatal hypocrisy. The text contrasts two corporate leaders. Tell me about the tech CEO who took the therapy culture's advice.
The book cites a male tech CEO who had to execute a round of company layoffs. Trying to be the modern, empathetic leader, he posted a video of himself crying, showing deep vulnerability about how hard the decision was for him.
And what was the result?
He was mercilessly mocked online, his board of directors questioned his stability, and he was eventually demoted. He projected weakness. Riker contrasts this directly with Elon Musk.
Right, Musk during the Tesla Model 3 production hell.
Exactly. Musk famously slept on the factory floor, worked 100-hour weeks, and projected absolute, unyielding, stoic authority. He didn't cry about the pressure, he absorbed it.
And that stoicism, Riker claims, is what boosted investor confidence, kept the company from bankruptcy, and drove Tesla's ultimate success.
The message the author delivers to men is stark. Society demands your vulnerability to make itself feel progressive, but the free market and female biology will ruthlessly punish you for actually displaying it.
This inherent adversarial dynamic leads directly into the book's deep dive into emotional warfare and the weaponization of false accusations. Riker spends significant time analyzing the fallout of Title IX tribunals on college campuses and the broader Me Too movement.
For him, these aren't justice movements. They're tools of asymmetrical warfare.
He cites high-profile cases like the Duke lacrosse scandal, where the players were falsely accused of rape and had their lives ruined before being completely exonerated.
He also brings up Brian Banks, the standout high school football star who had a full ride to USC and an NFL career waiting for him. He was falsely accused of rape, went to prison, spent years fighting to clear his name, and lost his entire athletic prime.
Only for the accuser to eventually be caught on tape, admitting she fabricated the entire story to avoid getting in trouble with her mother.
Riker uses these cases to show how easily the presumption of innocence is discarded when a man's future is weighed against a woman's unverified word.
There is a statistic in the Title IX chapter that completely threw me. Something about where the majority of these complaints actually originate before they ever become formal reports.
That is a critical data point. The text claims that 83% of Title IX's complaints actually originate from informal female gossip networks, whisper networks, group chats, dorm rumors, before they ever manifest as formal, documented reports to the university.
And Riker views this through his evolutionary lens.
He argues this is an ancestral mate guarding and social sabotage strategy. Women use reputation destruction to eliminate rivals or punish men who reject them or fail to commit. In the modern era, Title IX offices have simply institutionalized this gossip network, giving it the power to expel men without due process, cross-examination, or legal representation.
Because of this terrifying legal landscape, the book doesn't just theorize. It outlines intense, tactical, legal self-defense protocols for men. It reads like a literal survival guide. What are the specific steps Riker advises men to take to protect themselves?
Riker insists that men must view cohabitation and marriage as high-risk corporate mergers. He advises setting up strict, impenetrable financial firewalls, trusts, offshore accounts, prenuptial agreements, long before ever moving in with a woman.
But it goes beyond money into physical security. He insists on the absolute necessity of recording arguments, He tells men to install hidden nest cams in common areas of their own homes
Right.
just to disprove potential domestic violence claims.
Exactly. Because in a he said, she said domestic dispute, the man is almost always the one taken out in handcuffs. The video evidence is the only shield. He goes further, telling men to meticulously save Venmo receipts, keep GPS tracking logs, and document pharmacy visits to establish unassailable alibis.
If an accusation ever arises, you need absolute proof of where you were and what you spent.
Most controversially, the author advocates for preemptively striking in civil court. If a man is threatened with a false Me Too claim or a fake domestic violence charge during a breakup, Riker argues that waiting to defend yourself in criminal court is a losing strategy.
You must immediately file a massive defamation suit in civil court to seize the narrative and force the accuser into a costly legal defensive posture.
It's a deeply adversarial, paranoid, but according to Riker, statistically necessary view of modern relationships.
And moving into section 5, the book looks at how this adversarial culture is actively promoted and normalized by the media. Riker breaks down what he calls Hollywood's emasculation agenda. He argues that modern media deliberately, intentionally conditions men to be weak, apologetic, and submissive.
Riker draws a very sharp, lucrative contrast between what the legacy media tells us is good and what actually succeeds financially with the masses. He argues that audiences are starving for traditional masculinity.
He points to the massive, record-breaking box office success of unapologetically masculine media. Movies like Top Gun, Maverick, which celebrated brotherhood, competence, and duty.
He points to the dominance of shows like Yellowstone, which is fundamentally about a violent patriarch protecting his land and family. He points to the record-breaking concert sales of country artist Morgan Wallen.
These are properties that don't apologize for being male-centric.
Precisely. And he compares their success to the commercial failure of franchises that tried to force emotional vulnerability or inclusive, submissive portrayals onto historically masculine characters.
Riker cites the intense fan backlash to the recent James Bond films, where the ultimate stoic alpha male was suddenly put in therapy, made emotionally fragile, and killed off.
He points to the declining box office returns of certain Marvel films that sidelined male heroes to lecture the audience on toxic masculinity. His point is that the media elite are trying to socially engineer a weaker man, but the public's biological craving for strong men consistently rejects it.
He also goes hard after Disney and romantic comedies, arguing that they are basically psychological poison for both genders. How does he break down the rom-com effect?
He argues these films have essentially brainwashed generations of women to expect an impossible Prince Charming standard. A man who is a billionaire, looks like a supermodel, possesses infinite emotional intelligence, and focuses 100% of his energy on her.
But more destructively, he argues these movies teach young men a fatal strategy. Rom-coms teach boys that groveling, making grand public romantic gestures, acting as the best friend, and displaying extreme emotional sensitivity are how you win the girl.
In reality, Riker says, executing the rom-com strategy in the real world just gets men friend-zoned, ghosted, or used for free dinners.
Which brings us to a really fascinating, purely economic concept in the book, the simp paradox and sexual economics. Riker attempts to explain the modern digital economy of attention, specifically platforms like OnlyFans. Break down the paradox here.
The simp paradox describes a massive transfer of wealth that defies traditional economic logic. Riker points out that average invisible men, the bottom 80% from the Tinder data, are subsidizing this digital attention economy.
Men are collectively donating over $500 million annually to OnlyFans models, Twitch streamers, and Instagram influencers.
They are paying exorbitant amounts of money merely for the illusion of intimacy, for a parasocial relationship where the woman says their username on a screen.
And what are the women doing with that massive influx of wealth?
This is the crux of the paradox. According to Riker's evolutionary framework, those same women, now enriched and elevated in status by the financial contributions of the average men, use that newly acquired wealth and status to filter even more aggressively.
They reserve their actual physical relationships and reproductive access solely for the top tier, top 10% alpha men.
So the average man is literally funding his own obsolescence. He is paying for the microphone the woman uses to reject him.
It is a brutal, bleak economic breakdown of modern loneliness. But the book also points out a biological ticking clock that eventually crashes this market for the women. Riker notes the sheer tragic irony of the girl boss culture.
Yes, the author explores the biological wall that hypergamy eventually hits. Modern feminist culture encourages women to focus entirely on their careers, travel, and casual dating in their 20s, their peak fertility years.
They're told to delay marriage and family to be a girl boss. But then, right around age 35, the narrative panics and they are told to freeze their eggs.
And Riker pulls the actual medical data on egg freezing, which is rarely discussed, honestly.
What does the data say?
The text bluntly states that the live birth viability rate of eggs frozen at age 35 or older is statistically abysmal, often hovering around 3 to 5% per egg. It is a false promise sold by the fertility industry.
Riker points out the grim reality. While these women hit this biological fertility cliff in their late 30s and finally decide they are ready to settle down with the successful high-status men they spent their 20s ignoring, those men have aged into their peak earning years.
And those high-status men are using their wealth and status to bypass the 35-year-old girl bosses entirely, opting to date and marry 25-year-old women at peak fertility. The market corrects itself brutally along biological lines.
This systemic critique, the legal traps, the biological clocks, the skewed economics, leads to the final, most crucial section of the book. Section 6, The Unplugged Path and Reclaiming Masculinity. Given all these institutional traps, Riker doesn't just tell men to complain. He proposes a radical, actionable solution: strategic disengagement.
This ties heavily into the MGTOW movement.
For you listening, MGTOW stands for Men Going Their Own Way. What is the philosophy here?
The MGTOW philosophy, as Riker champions it, is the ultimate rejection of the rigged game. If the family courts are a cartel, if the dating market is hypergamous and transactional, and if society despises masculinity, the only logical winning move for a man is simply not to play.
Riker introduces the concept of the celibacy dividend. And to be clear, this isn't about taking a monk's vow of poverty or retreating to a cave. It's the exact opposite, right? It's about massive resource accumulation.
Correct. The celibacy dividend is purely economic. By consciously removing themselves from the dating market, eliminating the costs of dinners, drinks, vacations, engagement rings, and the massive time sink of navigating volatile relationships, men save immense amounts of capital and energy.
The text shares the story of a man named Diego from Miami. Diego was an average earner who was constantly broke, trying to maintain the lifestyle required to date in a superficial city like Miami. He decided to unplug.
He deleted all his dating apps, stopped going to bars, and focused entirely on his work and health.
And the financial result was immediate.
Staggering. Diego saved $28,000 in just 18 months. Riker even shares his own personal experience with the celibacy dividend. During a deeply focused phase in Dubai, where he completely abstained from dating and the social scene, he saved $78,000 in cash.
He then used that capital to start a location-independent business, freeing himself entirely from corporate HR departments and geographic ties.
The dividend is about redirecting the massive resources a man would normally spend chasing female validation into building his own absolute freedom.
And Riker points out that this isn't just an isolated Western internet phenomenon. He connects this to a massive demographic shift happening right now in Japan.
He looks at the herbivore men of Japan. The book notes that a staggering 40% of Japanese males under the age of 40 have entirely rejected dating, sex, and marriage. They are completely opted out.
Society calls them a crisis, but Riker argues they are actually pioneers. He views their behavior as a highly rational, predictable, and logical response to a sexual marketplace where female hypergamy is unchecked and the legal and financial risks of marriage are mathematically unjustifiable for men.
The men simply ran the cost-benefit analysis and chose peace.
So if men are unplugging from women, unplugging from the dating market, and unplugging from corporate rat races, what are they plugging into? A man needs a purpose. Riker says men must anchor their existence in building empires and finding their ikigai. Unpack that concept for us.
Ikigai is a Japanese concept that roughly translates to a reason for being, or your true life purpose. Riker argues that modern society has tricked men into believing their ikigai is female validation, getting the girl, buying the house, being the good provider.
But when that script is weaponized against them, they lose their reason to live.
Exactly. Riker demands that men shift their ikigai to creation, mastery, and brotherhood. A man's purpose must be anchored in things he can control. Building a business, mastering a martial art, creating art, or forging unbreakable bonds with other men.
The book concludes by highlighting the incredible life-saving power of male-centric spaces. He brings up this incredible initiative, the Men's Shed movement in Detroit.
The Men's Shed example is profound. In a city ravaged by industrial decline and high male suicide rates, this movement created spaces where men gathered. Not to sit in a circle and cry about their feelings, which we establish fails, but to do physical work together.
They did woodworking, restored old cars, and fixed broken appliances. They worked shoulder to shoulder.
And the text claims this environment of shared action, competence, and mastery slashed the male suicide rate in that specific cohort by an incredible 60%.
60%, just by letting men be men and build things together.
Yes, it proves Riker's point that men heal through action, through doing, and through utility, not through the feminized model of face-to-face talk therapy.
The author's final resounding call to arms is for men to aggressively seek out and embrace traditional male loyalty. He tells them to join mastermind groups, get into MMA gyms where respect is earned through physical resilience, and focus their entire lives on legacy architecture, building wealth and systems that outlast them, completely independent of the traditional family structure.
It's an incredibly dense, unapologetic, and challenging text that forces you to look at the scaffolding of society in a completely different, often uncomfortable light.
It really does. And it leaves us with a final provocative thought to chew on, something that extends beyond the book. If Riker is correct, if female hypergamy and male provider instincts are truly immutable, unchangeable biological codes written into our DNA over 200,000 years, what happens to this entire sexual and societal marketplace in the next 50 years?
As artificial intelligence begins to completely dominate the high-paying white-collar jobs that define status.
Right. And as artificial wombs potentially separate reproduction from female biology entirely, will this ancient biological programming finally break down into irrelevance? Or will we see an even more extreme, technologically fueled Atlas spiral, where the sexes completely detach from one another?
It is the ultimate existential question for our species. If the biological hardware is rendered obsolete by technology, the entire social contract has to be rewritten from scratch.
Exactly. Something heavy to think about for sure. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. As a reminder, we've been reviewing a highly detailed ebook aimed at the men's rights activist audience, exploring the author's arguments regarding the hidden history of our institutions and the evolutionary biology driving modern behavior.
If you want to dive into the deep end and read these arguments directly from the source, you need to check Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book today.
Also, make sure you follow the author at Conrad Pryker at Substack for his ongoing essays and analysis. And finally, please don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the show before you go. It means the world to us. See you next time.